The first mistake Vanessa Whitmore made was believing a funeral could be turned into a coronation without the dead man objecting. By 10:30 that gray November morning, the chapel at St. Bartholomew's was filled with the kind of silence only old money knows how to perform. Polished shoes on marble, black wool coats folded over gloved hands, pearl earrings catching the pale light from stained glass windows, and voices lowered not out of grief, but out of habit. Richard Whitmore had built half the luxury townhomes along the Connecticut shoreline, and every person in that room seemed to have owned, sold, borrowed against, or envied some piece of his empire. At the front, beside the closed mahogany casket, Vanessa stood like a portrait of expensive sorrow. Her black dress was tailored so perfectly it looked less chosen than commissioned. A thin veil covered part of her face, but not enough to hide the calm satisfaction resting at the corners of her mouth. She accepted condolences with a soft nod, one hand pressed lightly to her chest, the other displaying the wedding band Richard had given her 3 years earlier, a ring large enough to make subtlety file for unemployment. People approached her as though she had already inherited not only the estate, but the authority to decide who still mattered in Richard's world. She let them. She let every whispered Mrs. Whitmore settle around her shoulders like a title being pinned into place. 30 feet behind her, near the last row of pews, Claire Bennett sat with her 12-year-old son, Noah, almost invisible beneath the weight of everyone's careful avoidance. Claire wore a simple black coat, the same one she had worn to parent conferences, grocery runs, and court dates when Richard's lawyers argued that his obligations should remain practical, limited, reasonable. Human beings had a remarkable gift for making abandonment sound like accounting. Noah sat close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, his thin fingers tucked inside her palm. He had his father's dark blonde hair and the same thoughtful gray eyes that made adults lower their voices when they realized he understood more than they wished. Claire felt him stiffen whenever someone glanced back at them, then looked away too quickly. She squeezed his hand once, not as a warning, but as a promise. "Stay steady. I am here." She had not come for Richard's money. That was what none of them understood. She had not come to reopen old wounds, to stand in front of a casket and demand apologies from a man who could no longer offer them, or to compete with Vanessa's carefully arranged grief. She had come because Noah had asked, in a voice barely louder than the rain against his bedroom window, if it was wrong to say goodbye to a father who had mostly existed in phone calls, birthday checks, and photographs. Claire had told him no. Children should not have to earn the right to mourn complicated parents. Across the aisle, Vanessa turned slightly, as if she had felt Claire's presence disturb the clean shape of her victory. Their eyes met for one brief second. Vanessa's expression did not change, but her chin lifted by a fraction, a small, practiced gesture that said, "You are a guest here," and barely that. Claire did not look away. She had spent years learning that silence was not surrender. Sometimes silence was the only dignity left in a room full of people waiting for you to beg for permission to belong. The minister spoke about legacy, generosity, devotion, words that floated upward toward the carved ceiling and dissolved before touching anything real. Richard's brother dabbed at his eyes with a folded handkerchief. 2 board members exchanged a look when the estate was mentioned. Vanessa lowered her head at precisely the right moment. Noah stared at the casket with a confusion too old for his face. And Claire, seated in the back where the family had quietly placed her, felt the past gather around her like cold air under a door. She remembered the first apartment she and Richard had rented, 1,200 square feet above a bakery in New Haven, where the heat clanked all winter, and Richard sketched floor plans on napkins while she balanced their bills on a second-hand kitchen table. She remembered painting sample boards after midnight, answering client emails while Noah slept in a bassinet, believing she was building a family, not simply helping a man rehearse for a life where she would one day be edited out. At the end of the service, Vanessa stepped forward to receive the folded memorial program from the minister, her fingers closing around it like a deed. The room rose. Coats rustled. Rain tapped softly against the chapel windows. Then Vanessa looked past the mourners, past the flowers, directly at Claire, and smiled with the faint cruelty of someone who believed the final page had already been signed. Claire felt Noah's hand tighten in hers. She leaned down and whispered, "We'll leave quietly." But before they could move, Margaret Ellis, Richard's longtime attorney, appeared at the end of the pew, silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a sealed leather folder held against her chest. Her gaze rested first on Noah, then on Claire. "Mrs. Bennet," she said softly, though everyone nearby seemed to hear it anyway. "Mr. Whitmore left instructions. You and your son are required at the reading of the will this afternoon." For the first time all morning, Vanessa stopped smiling. By noon, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Hartford slick and silver beneath a sky the color of pewter. Claire drove the 12 miles from the chapel to Margaret Ellis's office with both hands on the steering wheel, though she could not remember tightening them. Noah sat beside her in the passenger seat, still wearing the black blazer he had outgrown by half an inch since spring. He had not spoken since they left the church. Every few minutes, Claire saw his reflection in the side window, his eyes fixed on the wet blur of traffic, his face holding that careful stillness children wear when they are trying not to make a hard day harder for the adult beside them. It broke something quiet inside her. "You do not have to say anything in there," she told him. "You just have to sit with me." Noah nodded without looking over. "Did Dad want us there?" The question was small, but it landed with the weight of all the years Richard had missed. Claire swallowed before answering. "I do not know everything your father wanted, but Mrs. Ellis would not have asked us to come unless he left something that involved you." It was the most honest answer she could give without turning bitterness into inheritance. Margaret's office occupied the top floor of a brick building near Bushnell Park, the kind of place where brass plaques, dark wood, and old leather chairs did their best to convince ordinary people that paper could be more powerful than pain. Claire had been there once before, 7 years earlier, during the final settlement conference, when Richard's attorneys had referred to her marriage as a domestic arrangement and her contributions as supportive in nature, as if love, labor, loyalty, and unpaid work were decorative items one might list after throw pillows. She remembered sitting across from men who had never washed a baby bottle at 2 in the morning, listening to them explain what her life was worth. Apparently, not much. Humanity had really outdone itself when it invented legal language for erasing women politely. The elevator opened to a quiet reception area smelling faintly of coffee, rain-damp wool, and lemon furniture polish. Vanessa was already there. Naturally, she stood near the window in a fitted black coat, her veil removed, her blonde hair swept into a low knot so smooth it looked professionally satined. Beside her were Richard's younger brother, Thomas Whitmore, and 2 members of the company board, both men with expensive watches and the anxious expressions of people pretending grief was not interfering with business. Vanessa turned when Claire and Noah entered. Her eyes moved first to Noah, then to Claire's coat, then to the plain black handbag hanging from Claire's shoulder. The inspection was quick, cruel, and almost invisible. "I was surprised Margaret invited you," Vanessa said, her voice soft enough to sound tasteful to anyone not listening carefully. "This is mostly a family matter." Claire felt Noah shift beside her. She placed a hand gently on his back. "Then Noah belongs here." For half a second, Vanessa's smile tightened. Thomas cleared his throat and looked away, because courage, in some families, was apparently stored in a separate building no one could find. Before Vanessa could answer, the inner office door opened and Margaret Ellis stepped out. She wore a charcoal suit, pearl studs, and the calm expression of a woman who had watched rich people mistake possession for character for more than 30 years. "Everyone may come in now," she said. The conference room beyond was long and narrow, with a polished walnut table running down the center and a wall of windows overlooking the wet trees of the park. At the head of the table sat 2 leather folders. One was thick, marked with Richard Whitmore's full legal name. The other was slimmer, sealed with a red evidence label and placed slightly apart, like a secret waiting for its cue. Vanessa saw it too. Claire noticed the tiny pause in her step, the way her fingers pressed against the clasp of her purse. It was the first human crack in her perfect morning. They took their seats. Vanessa chose the chair nearest Margaret, as if proximity might influence law. Claire sat halfway down the table with Noah beside her. The boy's knees did not quite reach the floor. Margaret opened the larger folder and adjusted her glasses. "Before I begin," she said, "I want to make one thing clear. Mr. Whitmore amended certain portions of his estate plan 3 weeks before his death. Those amendments were witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by an independent physician who confirmed his mental capacity." The room seemed to contract. Vanessa's face remained composed, but the color beneath her makeup changed by one pale degree. Claire looked at the sealed second folder, then at Margaret's steady hands. For the first time that day, she understood that she had not been invited as an afterthought. She had been summoned because Richard had left a door behind him, and someone in that room was terrified it might open. Margaret did not open the will immediately. She let the silence settle first, not dramatically, not cruelly, but with the patience of someone who knew that powerful families often revealed themselves before a single document did. The rainwater on the windows slipped downward in thin, trembling lines, turning the park outside into a wash of gray trees and blurred headlights. Inside, the conference room felt warmer than it should have, the air thick with wool coats, expensive perfume, and the sour little electricity of people waiting to find out how much a dead man had valued them. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and rested her hands neatly on her knee, her diamond ring catching the overhead light with almost comic persistence. Even in mourning, the thing insisted on performing. "Before this becomes complicated," Vanessa said, her voice smooth enough to pass as reasonable, "I think it is important to acknowledge Richard's intentions in life, not just on paper. He and I shared a home, a marriage, responsibilities. The estate has been under my care for the last 3 years." Claire kept her eyes on Margaret, but she felt every face turn toward her. There it was, the first move, wrapped in manners and dipped in poison. Vanessa was not arguing yet. She was arranging the room, placing herself at the center and Claire at the edge, exactly where she believed a former wife belonged. Thomas shifted in his chair. One of the board members looked down at his phone, then pretended he had not. Noah's shoulder pressed lightly against Claire's arm. "No one is disputing your marriage to Richard," Margaret said. "Good," Vanessa replied. "Then there should be no confusion about who has the legal standing to manage his personal effects, his residence, and his public legacy." Public legacy. Claire almost smiled at that, which would have been inappropriate, and therefore tempting. Richard's public legacy had always been polished stone, charity plaques, ribbon cuttings, and photographs taken from his better side. His private legacy was sitting beside her in a too-small blazer, trying to breathe quietly in a room where adults were discussing his father as if the man had been a company merger with cufflinks. Vanessa turned slightly toward Claire, and her expression softened into something that might have fooled strangers. "I do not mean to be unkind, but after the divorce, Richard built a separate life. We all did. It would be unfair to blur boundaries now, especially when emotions are high." Claire had heard that word before. Boundaries. Richard used it when he missed Noah's school concert because of a closing dinner in Manhattan. His lawyer used it when Claire asked why the child support payments arrived late. Vanessa used it now because it sounded cleaner than exclusion. Human cruelty had an entire wardrobe of respectable vocabulary. "My only concern is Noah," Claire said quietly. Her voice surprised even her. It did not shake. Vanessa gave a small, sympathetic nod, the kind one might offer to someone who had misunderstood seating arrangements. "And I am sure Richard provided for him appropriately. But the Whitmore estate itself is not a playground, Claire. It is a responsibility. There are staff, taxes, land trusts, commercial holdings, historical preservation requirements. It requires judgment." The last word landed with a delicate thud. Judgment. As if Claire had spent the last 7 years raising a child, repairing a life, managing a household on reduced support, and rebuilding her consulting work from a laptop at the kitchen table without ever encountering responsibility. Margaret's gaze moved from Vanessa to Claire, then to Noah. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, using Vanessa's title with surgical precision, "this meeting is not a negotiation." Vanessa's smile flickered. "I understand that. Then I recommend allowing the documents to speak." The room went still again. Claire looked at the sealed folder beside the main will, and a memory rose before she could stop it. Richard at 29, standing in their first apartment in shirt sleeves, holding newborn Noah like he was afraid the baby might break or reveal him. He had whispered, "Whatever happens, he comes first." At the time, Claire had believed him. Years later, belief had become a luxury she no longer purchased. Margaret opened the thick folder and began with the formal language: full name, residence, sound mind, revocation of prior instruments. The words moved slowly, each one carrying the dry weight of law. Vanessa listened with her chin raised, but her right thumb rubbed once against the side of her ring. Claire noticed. So did Margaret. Then, just as the rhythm of legal language had begun to numb the room, Margaret paused at the bottom of the first page and lifted her eyes. "There is a preliminary instruction," she said. Mr. Whitmore requested that his son, Noah Bennett Whitmore, remain present for the entire reading. Vanessa's head turned sharply. Noah looked up. Claire felt the room change around them, not loudly, not visibly, but unmistakably. For the first time that afternoon, the estate was no longer circling Vanessa. It had begun, quietly and terribly, to turn toward the boy. Margaret's announcement seemed to take the oxygen out of the room by teaspoons. Noah Bennett Whitmore remained very still, his name hanging in the air with a weight no 12-year-old should have had to carry. Claire felt his hand find hers beneath the table, and this time, his fingers were cold. Across from them, Vanessa's face performed a remarkable little ceremony of restraint. Surprise appeared first, sharp and bright, then vanished beneath wounded dignity, then returned as something colder. "That is unusual," she said. Richard never discussed involving Noah in estate matters. Margaret turned a page with care. Richard was not required to discuss every instruction with every beneficiary. The sentence was polite enough to wear pearls, but it landed cleanly. Thomas Whitmore glanced at the sealed folder again. One of the board members, a square-jawed man named Paul Kendrick, shifted his chair half an inch back from the table, as if distance might protect him from whatever was coming. Claire watched all of them with the strange calm that sometimes arrives when humiliation has happened so many times the body finally refuses to pay full price for it. She had spent years being treated as a footnote in Richard's story, the first wife, the difficult chapter, the woman who had not understood the demands of greatness. Yet here they were, in a room filled with mahogany and money, and the first name Richard had ordered protected was not Vanessa's. It was Noah's. Margaret began reading again. The early provisions were exactly what everyone expected, which somehow made them worse. Donations to 3 museums, a scholarship fund at Yale, a 7-figure gift to the Whitmore Family Foundation, and specific bequests to longtime employees, including a college fund for the daughter of Richard's first assistant. Vanessa listened with increasing impatience, though she tried to hide it behind a solemn expression. Every generous line that did not name her seemed to carve a little more polish from her composure. Claire noticed the faint tap of Vanessa's nail against the table, once, twice, then stillness. Human greed had manners when it thought cameras might be watching. "To my wife, Vanessa Whitmore," Margaret read at last, and Vanessa's chin lifted before she could stop it. "I leave my personal jewelry collection purchased during our marriage, the contents of the primary suite at the Whitmore residence, excluding family archives, and the balance of the private household account held at Hartford National Bank." A silence followed. It was not empty. It was crowded with calculation. Vanessa blinked once. "That cannot be all." Margaret did not answer immediately. She continued reading. "My wife may remain at the Whitmore residence for a period not exceeding 90 days following my death, during which time the estate shall cover ordinary household expenses, staff wages, utilities, and reasonable relocation costs." Thomas looked down at the table. Paul Kendrick rubbed one hand over his mouth. Vanessa sat perfectly upright, but something in her posture had gone rigid. 90 days, she repeated, each syllable polished thin. "Richard and I lived in that house together." "Yes," Margaret said. "The document acknowledges that." "Acknowledges it?" Vanessa's voice rose, then lowered itself quickly, remembering the room. "Margaret, I was his wife. Not a tenant. Not a guest. His wife." Claire felt Noah flinch at the anger beneath the softness. She leaned slightly closer to him, offering the shelter of her shoulder without making him feel watched. Margaret folded her hands over the page. "No one here is disputing your marital status. Then why am I being spoken to as though I am being moved out of a hotel suite?" Vanessa's smile had disappeared now. In its place was disbelief, raw and almost honest. "Richard promised me security. He promised me that home. He said the estate would be handled." The word handled told Claire more than Vanessa probably meant to reveal. Not shared, not preserved, not protected. Handled. As if grief were a transaction with better stationery. Margaret's gaze moved toward the sealed second folder. "The primary estate is governed by a separate clause and trust instruction." Vanessa followed her eyes. "What separate clause?" Claire felt Noah's fingers tighten again, but she could no longer reassure him with certainty. Her own pulse had begun to beat slowly, heavily, as if her heart were walking down a long hallway toward a door she had not known existed. Margaret picked up the slim sealed folder and placed it in front of her. The red label across its edge was signed, dated, and notarized 3 weeks earlier. "Before I open this," she said, "I am legally obligated to state that Mr. Whitmore reaffirmed this instruction in person, on video, and in writing. He also requested that everyone present hear it at the same time." Vanessa stared at the folder as though it had insulted her. Claire looked at Noah, whose gray eyes were fixed on Margaret's hands. For 7 years, the Whitmore family had taught him that belonging could be measured in invitations, last names, and which door opened when he arrived. Now a sealed document sat on a table in Hartford, quietly preparing to argue otherwise. Margaret broke the red seal with the quiet precision of a surgeon opening a letter from the past. No one moved. Even the city noise beyond the windows seemed to fall back, as though Hartford itself had leaned away from the glass to listen. Vanessa's gaze stayed fixed on the folder, but Claire watched Margaret's face instead. There was no triumph there, no theatrical pleasure, only a grave professionalism that made the moment feel heavier. Whatever Richard had left inside that folder, it was not casual. It had been placed there deliberately, like a stone set into the foundation of a house everyone else had mistaken for decoration. Margaret removed 3 pages, then a notarized affidavit, then a small flash drive sealed in a clear evidence sleeve. Vanessa's eyes dropped to the flash drive, and for the first time, her confidence looked less like armor and more like expensive wrapping paper around panic. "What is that?" she asked. "A recorded statement," Margaret said. "It will be addressed later, if necessary." "If necessary?" Vanessa repeated. "This is my husband's estate. I would think anything recorded by him is necessary immediately." Margaret looked over her glasses. The order of reading was specified by Mr. Whitmore. The words closed the matter. Claire felt Noah inhale beside her, slow and uneven. She wanted to cover his ears, not from profanity or cruelty, but from the civilized language adults used when they were about to fight over belonging. Margaret began to read. Supplemental trust instruction, executed and reaffirmed by Richard Allen Whitmore. Regarding the primary residence known as Whitmore House, the associated grounds, the family archives, and controlling interest in Whitmore Estates holdings. Paul Kendrick stopped pretending not to care. Thomas Whitmore sat straighter. Vanessa's lips parted slightly. Claire did not fully understand the legal shape of what she was hearing, but she understood the effect. The room had shifted from condolence to threat. "In the event of my death before my son, Noah Bennett Whitmore, reaches the age of 21, Margaret continued, the above-described assets shall not pass through direct spousal distribution, nor shall they be treated as marital property for the purpose of personal inheritance." Vanessa made a small sound, not loud enough to be called an interruption, but too sharp to be ignored. Margaret did not pause. "Said assets shall be placed into the Noah Bennett Whitmore Family Trust to be administered for his benefit, education, housing, health, and long-term stability." Claire stared at the table. The words education, housing, health, and stability moved through her like warm light entering a room that had been closed for years. Not luxury, not revenge, stability. The word was so ordinary it nearly undid her. Vanessa leaned forward. Administered by whom? Margaret turned the page. Claire felt, rather than saw, every person looked toward the document. Until Noah Bennett Whitmore reaches 21 years of age, the acting trustee and residential guardian of Whitmore House shall be Claire Evelyn Bennett, provided she remains his legal, custodial parent and acts in accordance with the fiduciary terms stated herein. The room went utterly still. Noah turned to his mother with wide gray eyes. Claire could not speak. Her own name, spoken in that room, sounded unfamiliar, not because it was wrong, but because the Whitmores had spent so long treating it as something that belonged outside the door. Vanessa's face emptied, then filled again with color. "That is impossible." Margaret placed one hand on the page. "It is not. Richard would never give her control of that house. He did not give Mrs. Bennett the house for personal enrichment," Margaret said. "He appointed her trustee and guardian of the residence for Noah's benefit." Vanessa laughed once, softly, without humor. That is a distinction designed to make theft sound noble. Claire finally looked at her. I did not ask for this. No, Vanessa said, her voice sharpening. You just appeared at the funeral with your son and waited for everyone to pity you. Noah's shoulders curled inward. That small movement, more than the insult itself, brought Claire fully back into her body. She turned toward Vanessa, calm settling over her like a coat. Do not use my child to make your disappointment look righteous. Thomas looked at Claire then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Margaret continued before Vanessa could answer. There is more. The sentence landed harder than the clause itself. Vanessa froze. Claire looked again at the sealed pages in Margaret's hand and understood with a quiet chill that Richard had not merely protected Noah. He had anticipated resistance. And whatever came next had been written for the person who believed grief was just another doorway into ownership. Vanessa stood so suddenly that the legs of her chair gave a small, polished scrape against the conference room floor. It was not loud, but in that room it sounded enormous, the kind of sound that makes every person pretend not to react while reacting completely. Margaret looked up from the document, her expression unchanged. Claire felt Noah's hand tighten beneath the table, and she curled her fingers gently around his, reminding him, without words, that he was not the one who had caused this, not the one who had to fix it, not the one who needed to shrink so adults could keep their pride comfortable. Vanessa placed both palms on the table. Her diamond ring flashed under the recessed lights, bright and useless. This is absurd, she said. Richard was grieving when he wrote this. He was ill. He was emotional. He was probably being pressured. The last word slid across the table and stopped in front of Claire. There it was. Not spoken directly. Not yet, because Vanessa still knew how to decorate an accusation before serving it. Claire kept her voice low. I did not know this clause existed. Vanessa turned to her then, and the veil of courtesy finally fell away. How convenient, Thomas murmured. Vanessa. But there was no force behind it. The Whitmore men had always had a talent for sounding concerned from a safe distance. No, Vanessa said, not looking at him. Someone needs to say what everyone is thinking. She walks into the funeral after years of barely being part of Richard's life, brings the boy, sits in the back like some tragic little painting, and suddenly a trust appears handing her control of the house, the company, the family archives. Noah's face went pale. Claire's first instinct was to shield him from the words, but some truths had already entered the room. Protecting him now meant not letting them define him. Do not call my son the boy, Claire said. The sentence was quiet, but it cut cleanly through the room. Vanessa blinked, not because she was frightened, but because she had expected shame and received a boundary instead. Margaret placed the second page flat on the table. Mrs. Whitmore, your objections may be formally recorded after the reading is complete. For now, I will continue. You will not continue as though this is normal. Vanessa's voice trembled at the edges now, and the tremor made her angrier. Richard loved that estate. He knew what it meant. Whitmore House is not just a residence. It is the center of his name. Margaret's eyes moved briefly to Noah. That appears to be precisely why he made this instruction. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It had teeth. Claire looked down at the polished table and saw a faint reflection of herself, black coat, tired eyes, a woman who had learned to survive on less than she deserved and still pack lunch every morning, still remember permission slips, still sit beside her son through math homework and fever nights and birthdays where Richard's gift arrived by courier. Vanessa saw a state. Claire saw all the rooms Noah had never been allowed to enter without feeling like a visitor. Richard changed his mind. Vanessa said, softer now, dangerous in a different way. People do that near the end. They become sentimental, guilty, confused. Margaret lifted the notarized affidavit. The physician's evaluation says otherwise. His capacity was confirmed. His instructions were consistent across 3 meetings. Paul Kendrick leaned forward despite himself. 3 meetings? Margaret nodded. Over 6 weeks. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. This does not concern the board. It concerns controlling interest, Paul said carefully. His caution was almost elegant. Money had made a philosopher of him in under 10 seconds. Vanessa's jaw tightened. Richard would not endanger his company by placing it under Claire's influence. Claire almost laughed, not from amusement, but from the exhaustion of hearing the same old lie dressed in a new suit. Influence. as though she had not helped Richard edit early investor decks at their kitchen table while Noah slept in the next room, as though she had not introduced him to his first private client through a woman from her graduate program, as though a man's empire became his alone the moment it became profitable enough to need better lighting. Margaret turned another page. The trust does not give Mrs. Bennet operational control of daily business. It places the controlling shares in trust for Noah, with voting oversight assigned jointly to Mrs. Bennet and an independent fiduciary until Noah reaches 21. The fiduciary has already been named. Vanessa went still. Who? Margaret paused, then answered with the same calm that had become almost merciless. Eleanor Price, retired judge of the Connecticut Superior Court. Thomas exhaled. Under his breath. Even Paul looked impressed. Vanessa sank slowly back into her chair, not defeated, not yet, but forced for the first time to understand that Richard had not left behind a sentimental note. He had left a structure. Claire looked at Noah. His eyes were fixed on the table, but his shoulders had loosened by the smallest degree. Margaret rested her hand on the final page in the folder. There is still one additional enforcement provision. Vanessa's head lifted. Claire felt the air sharpen again. Somewhere beyond the glass, a siren passed faintly through the wet city streets, rising and fading like a warning no one could afford to ignore. Margaret's fingertips rested on the final page, but she did not lift it right away. She looked at each person around the table as if she were giving them one last chance to remember who they were before the law finished doing it for them. Vanessa sat very still now, both hands folded in front of her, her ring no longer flashing because her fingers had stopped moving. Claire could hear the faint hum of the heating system, the distant elevator bell beyond the conference room door, the soft tick of a wall clock that seemed suddenly rude in its determination to keep measuring ordinary time while Noah's future was being rearranged in legal sentences. Margaret drew in a slow breath and began. Enforcement Provision C. Any individual, beneficiary, spouse, relative, executive officer, or representative who knowingly attempts to remove, displace, intimidate, restrict, or otherwise interfere with the residential rights of Noah Bennet Whitmore or his legal custodial parent within 90 days of my death shall forfeit any discretionary benefit, relocation allowance, household account access, or personal property claim otherwise granted under this instrument. Vanessa's face changed so quickly that Claire almost missed it. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The kind that arrives when a person realizes the trap they are standing in was not built by an enemy, but by their own footsteps. Thomas whispered, Vanessa. And this time his voice carried something closer to alarm. Paul Kendrick looked from Margaret to Vanessa, then down at the table, where his reflection seemed deeply interested in not being involved. Claire felt Noah turn toward her, confused. Mom, he whispered, what does that mean? Claire kept her voice gentle. It means your father wanted to make sure no one could push us away from the house before everything was settled. She said us because the word mattered. Noah heard it. His shoulders lowered a fraction. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Margaret slid a separate document from beneath the page. This office received a notice yesterday morning from Whitmore House Management, copied to Mrs. Bennet by courier, instructing her to surrender any keys, remove any personal belongings connected to Mr. Whitmore, and refrain from bringing Noah Bennet Whitmore onto the property without written permission from Mrs. Vanessa Whitmore. The room went cold in a way no thermostat could explain. Claire remembered the envelope. Cream paper, raised letterhead, delivered just as she was helping Noah choose a tie for the funeral. She had placed it unopened in her bag because there had not been room in that morning for one more Cruelty. Apparently, Cruelty had filed paperwork and arrived early. Margaret placed the notice on the table, facing Vanessa. It bears your electronic signature and was sent through counsel at 8:43 yesterday morning. Vanessa stared at it. That was a standard administrative notice. It directed a minor beneficiary and his custodial parent away from the residence within the protected period. I did not know about this provision. The provision does not require prior knowledge, Margaret said. It requires conduct. There it was, stripped of perfume, diamonds, and titles. Conduct. Not intention. Not image. Not who looked more like a widow under chapel lights. What you did. Claire felt a strange ache rise behind her ribs. She had spent so many years being asked to explain tone, context, emotional history, and whether she had misunderstood Richard, Vanessa, the lawyers, the family, the silence. But this document did not ask her to prove how exclusion felt. It simply named the act and attached a consequence. There was mercy in that, almost brutal mercy. Vanessa leaned back slowly. You are saying I lose what Richard left me because of one letter. Margaret's eyes did not soften. I am saying the document states that any attempt to interfere with Noah's protected access triggers forfeiture of the benefits listed. The notice you authorized appears to do that. Appears. Vanessa seized the word. So it is not settled. A probate judge will confirm the application if you contest it. Margaret slid another copy forward. But Mr. Whitmore anticipated that possibility as well. Judge Eleanor Price has already been notified as fiduciary, and the trust petition was filed this morning. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Paul Kendrick whispered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or accounting. Vanessa looked at Claire then, and for the first time all day, her expression held no performance. Only fury, disbelief, and the humiliating knowledge that she had not been defeated by a dramatic speech or a clever ambush. She had signed her own undoing before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Claire met her gaze without satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been easy, too easy. But Noah was beside her, and this moment had to teach him something better than revenge. Margaret lifted the flash drive sealed in its clear sleeve. There is one more item Mr. Whitmore requested we review before this meeting ends. Vanessa looked at the small piece of plastic as if it were a living thing. Claire felt Noah's hand slide back into hers. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the glass, while Richard Whitmore's final voice waited in silence on the table. Margaret stood and crossed to the small media console beneath the wall screen, carrying the sealed flash drive as if it weighed far more than plastic should. No one spoke while she opened the evidence sleeve and inserted it into the laptop. The screen remained black for several seconds, reflecting the conference room in faint, ghostly shapes. Vanessa rigid in her chair, Thomas with his hands clasped too tightly, Paul Kendrick suddenly fascinated by the grain of the table, Claire with one hand wrapped around Noah's and the other resting still in her lap. Then Richard Whitmore appeared on the screen. The room seemed to inhale. He was seated in what Claire recognized as the library at Whitmore House, the one with green walls, brass lamps, and built-in shelves that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. He looked thinner than she remembered from the last custody exchange, his face drawn, his silver blonde hair less carefully arranged, but his eyes were clear. For a moment, Claire forgot the people around her. She saw only the man who had once stood barefoot in their first kitchen, laughing because Noah had thrown cereal across the floor like confetti. Then the image shifted into the man who had missed birthdays, signed checks late, let lawyers speak for him, and allowed silence to do the cruel work he lacked the courage to perform himself. Human memory was an awful little courtroom, always calling witnesses no one had prepared for. Richard looked slightly below the camera, then back up. If this is being played, he said, his voice quieter than it had been in life, but steady, then I am gone, and some of you are probably angry. Vanessa's mouth tightened. Noah leaned forward by an inch. I am not recording this to punish anyone, Richard continued. I am recording it because I spent too many years letting other people decide what my choices meant, including me. I told myself I was protecting the company. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself that Claire was strong enough to manage whatever I failed to handle. Claire felt those words settle in her chest with a pain so old it had become part of the furniture. Richard paused on the screen, and when he spoke again, his voice roughened. That was cowardice wearing a respectable suit, me than the people inside it. I will not pretend I treated her fairly. Noah's grip on Claire's hand tightened. Claire did not look at him, because if she did, she might break the careful composure that was holding them both upright. Richard took a slow breath. But this trust is not an apology to Claire. It is protection for Noah. My son should never have to wonder whether he belongs in the family whose name he carries. He should never be treated as a visitor in the house built partly from the years his mother gave up. Vanessa whispered, "This is manipulation," but the words had no place to go. They fell flat and small. That the estate had not been the real inheritance in that room. The real inheritance was the truth Richard had finally been brave enough to leave behind, wrapped in law because he had failed to deliver it in life. The blank screen held the room longer than Richard's face had. No one seemed willing to be the first person to move after hearing a dead man speak with more honesty than he had managed while alive. Claire kept one arm around Noah, feeling the sharp line of his shoulder beneath the wool blazer, the small tremors he was trying to hide, because children often mistake composure for kindness to adults. He did not cry, enough to satisfy the tired, wounded part of her that still remembered Vanessa's photograph appearing in society pages before the divorce papers were final. But revenge was a poor teacher for a boy who had already inherited too much adult damage. "I do not have room in my life to hate you," Claire said. "I have a child to raise." The simplicity of it seemed to irritate Vanessa more than anger would have. She pushed back from the table, then stopped herself from standing again. "Access," Vanessa's order to deny it. Two pieces of paper, one protecting a boy, the other trying to erase him from the doorway before the funeral programs had cooled. "This will be reviewed by Judge Price," Margaret said. "Until then, temporary authority over the residence will transfer to the trust administrator. Mrs. Bennett will receive escorted access to Whitmore House tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock to collect records, personal items belonging to Noah, and any materials required for the trust inventory." Vanessa's face tightened. "I still live there." "For now," Margaret said. "Under the remaining occupancy terms, if the court determines forfeiture does not apply to that portion." The phrase "if the court determines" landed softly, but it changed the room. Vanessa had entered believing she owned the house. Now she was being told she might be allowed to remain in it, temporarily, by permission of the very legal structure she had tried to outrun. Claire looked down at Noah's hand resting on the table. His fingers were still, but not clenched. That was something. A small thing. Sometimes survival began in such unimpressive measurements. Margaret gathered the papers into a careful stack. "This meeting is concluded for today." Chairs shifted. Rain blurred the windows. Feel like something Claire had dreamed under bad lighting. At 9:47, she turned her old silver Subaru through the iron gates of Whitmore House, with Noah silent beside her and Margaret Ellis's appointed estate officer following in a black sedan behind them. The driveway curved for nearly a quarter-mile through bare November maples, their wet branches shining like ink against the pale Connecticut sky. At the end of it, the house appeared exactly as Claire remembered and not at all the same. A Georgian mansion of white columns, slate roof, and too many windows reflecting a world that had never asked permission to exclude her. Noah leaned forward slightly. "I have only been here twice," he said. Claire kept both hands on the wheel. "I know." He had been 5 the first time, invited for 2 supervised hours during a summer garden party where Richard introduced him to guests as "my son," then handed him off to a housekeeper when a senator arrived. The second time had been after Christmas, 3 years ago, when Vanessa had insisted the visit be kept brief because the house was still being reset after the holidays, as if a child were a spill on imported carpet. Now they were driving up the same gravel road under the authority of a trust document Richard had signed too late, but not too late to matter. Life had a talent for delivering justice after everyone was exhausted, because apparently punctuality was too much to ask from the universe. Removed her sunglasses slowly. "I am aware of the order." "Then we should proceed." Claire expected Vanessa to argue. Instead, she looked at Noah. Her gaze was not soft, exactly, but something had changed since the video. Maybe not remorse. Maybe only calculation adjusting to daylight. "Your father kept some things for you in the East Study," she said. Noah did not answer. Claire felt the careful tension in him, the way he stood half a step behind her without meaning to. Diane opened the front door with a key from the court-sealed envelope, and the sound of the lock turning seemed to pass through the columns, the marble foyer, the portraits on the walls, and all the years Claire had been told she no longer belonged there. Inside, Whitmore House smelled of beeswax, lilies, and cold fireplaces. The foyer stretched upward 2 stories, crowned by a chandelier that Claire had once helped Richard choose from a restoration catalog, back when he called her taste the reason clients trusted him. Her eyes went to the curved staircase, the black and white floor, the side table where a silver-framed wedding photograph of Richard and Vanessa had already been turned slightly away, perhaps by a servant, perhaps by Vanessa herself, perhaps by no one and everything. Never sent, a Little League schedule with Noah's games circled, and a small wooden sailboat with chipped blue paint remained near the doorway, arms folded, her attorney beside her, both of them reduced to witnesses in a house they had expected to control. After a while, Noah picked up the winter concert program and turned it over. Richard had written one sentence on the back in blue ink. I should have been there. Noah stared at it for so long that Claire felt her own breath begin to hurt. Mom, he said quietly. Why did he keep these if he never came? There were answers that would have protected Richard, answers that would have protected Claire, and answers that would have made the room more comfortable for everyone who did not deserve comfort. Claire chose the only one that respected her son. Sometimes people love in ways that are too weak to become action, she said. That does not make the love enough. But it may mean it was real. Noah nodded, not satisfied, not healed, but given something honest enough to hold. Diane closed the first box and marked it for the trust inventory. The family archives are in the library, she said. Vanessa stepped forward then, her composure returning in brittle pieces. The archives contain private Whitmore materials, generational documents. They are not appropriate for removal. Diane looked at her clipboard. No one is removing them today. We are documenting protected assets. Protected from whom? Vanessa asked. No one answered immediately, which was unfortunate for her because silence had become rather good at answering on its own. They moved into the library, and Claire felt the past rise around her with the scent of leather, cedar, and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls. The fourth held tall windows overlooking the back lawn, where winter-bare hedges framed a stone terrace Claire had once designed with Richard on a legal pad during their 2nd year of marriage. Vanessa's decorator had changed the rugs, the curtains, the lamps, but the bones of the room were still Claire's work, quietly surviving beneath newer taste. Diane opened the archive cabinet with a court-issued key. Inside were property deeds, trust records, architectural plans, photographs, and several bound ledgers from Richard's early projects. Paul Kendrick arrived midway through the inventory, summoned by Diane to identify corporate documents, his face carefully neutral and his coat still damp from the driveway. When Diane opened the 3rd drawer, Paul leaned closer. First time since they had entered Whitmore House, Noah smiled, not broadly, not happily, but with a quiet pride that lit something in Claire no court order ever could. Vanessa turned toward the window, her reflection thin and furious in the glass. The house had begun the morning as Richard's monument. By noon, it was becoming a record, and records, unlike people, had the irritating habit of remembering what everyone else preferred to forget. By late afternoon, the light inside Whitmore House had turned gold and thin, stretching across the library floor like something reluctant to leave. Diane Mercer had finished photographing the partnership records, the trust documents, the archive drawers, and the 3 bankers' boxes marked with Noah's name. Paul Kendrick had gone quiet after the deferred equity schedule appeared, which Claire found almost impressive. Men who managed millions for a living tended to become suddenly delicate when a woman's forgotten signature threatened to become arithmetic. Vanessa's attorney made several careful notes, but his earlier confidence had drained away, replaced by the professional caution of a man who now understood his client's battlefield had more minds than maps. Vanessa stood near the library windows, facing the back lawn, her arms wrapped around herself in a pose that almost looked like grief, until Claire remembered how many times grief and pride wore the same coat. Noah sat on the leather sofa with the small blue sailboat in his lap, running one thumb along its chipped paint. Claire watched him for a moment, then turned back to Diane. What happens now? Diane closed her leather portfolio. Judge Price will review the enforcement provision, the notice sent by Mrs. Whitmore, and the newly located equity documents. Until probate issues a final order, Whitmore House remains protected under temporary trust supervision. Mrs. Bennett, you and Noah will have scheduled access. Mrs. Whitmore will be notified of any change to her occupancy status through counsel. Vanessa turned from the window. You make it sound as if I am being managed out of my own life. Diane's expression did not change. I am describing the order. Vanessa looked at Claire then, and for once, there was no polished insult waiting in her eyes. Only exhaustion, anger, and the helplessness of someone who had confused possession with permanence. Do you feel better now? She asked. Claire could have said many things. She could have mentioned the years of being treated like an inconvenience, the late payments, the ignored school programs, the party invitations that never came, the way Vanessa had tried to close a door on a child before Richard was even buried. But the house was too full of echoes already. No, Claire said. This does not make the past better. Vanessa's face tightened, as if she had expected victory and found something harder to argue with. Then what was the point? Claire looked at Noah, at the sailboat in his hands, at the shelves filled with ledgers that finally remembered her name. The point is that Noah does not have to spend his life wondering whether he was allowed to belong. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Noah stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the terrace, the bare hedges, the long lawn falling toward the trees. "Did you help design that?" he asked, nodding toward the stonework. Claire followed his gaze. "A long time ago." "It is beautiful," he said. 3 ordinary words, and somehow they reached deeper than Richard's video, deeper than the documents, deeper than any apology sealed in law. Claire felt her throat tighten, but she smiled. "Thank you." Vanessa looked away first. Maybe shame had finally found her. Maybe it was only strategy taking a breath. Either way, it no longer mattered as much as it had yesterday. Diane handed Claire a temporary access packet, 2 keys, a schedule, and a copy of the court order. The keys were heavier than Claire expected, cold in her palm. Not trophies, not weapons, just metal shaped into permission no one could politely revoke. Noah slipped the sailboat into its box and carried it himself. As they walked toward the front door, Claire passed the marble foyer where she had once stood beside Richard as a young wife, believing the future was something love could build if both people worked hard enough. She knew better now. Love without courage became absence. Wealth without conscience became theater. Paper without truth became a cage. But truth, when finally written clearly enough, could open a door. Outside, the air smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Noah paused on the top step and looked back at the house. "Are we going to live here?" Claire rested a hand on his shoulder. "Not today. Maybe not ever. A house is not the same thing as home." He nodded slowly. "Then why did Dad leave it to me?" Claire looked at the white columns, the tall windows, the life that had tried to erase them and failed. Because he finally understood that home is not what you own. It is who you protect. Noah leaned into her side, and together they walked down the steps toward their old Subaru, past Vanessa's silent attorney, past the estate officer's black sedan, past the gate that had once made them feel like outsiders. Claire did not look back again. She had not won because Vanessa lost. She had won because her son left that house taller than he had entered it. And sometimes, in a world that teaches people to measure justice in dollars, the quietest victory is watching a child finally believe he was never disposable. 2 weeks later, the probate hearing took place in a quiet courtroom in Hartford where the carpet was gray, the walls were beige, and justice, because humanity enjoys irony, arrived under fluorescent lights with a docket number. Claire sat at the petitioner's table with Margaret Ellis on one side and Noah on the other, his school blazer replaced by a navy sweater and khaki pants, because Claire had refused to dress him like a miniature defendant in a life he had not chosen. Across the aisle, Vanessa sat beside her attorney, composed again, though the composure had changed. It no longer gleamed. It held. There was something smaller about her now, not kinder exactly, but less certain that the room would rearrange itself around her disappointment. Judge Eleanor Price entered without ceremony, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair, clear eyes, and the particular calm of someone who had spent decades listening to people confuse wanting something with deserving it. The hearing did not take long. That surprised Claire. After years of legal conversations stretching across months like bad weather, she expected arguments, objections, polished outrage, perhaps one last attempt to make her look opportunistic in front of strangers. Instead, the facts sat on the record with almost embarrassing neatness. Richard had reaffirmed the trust. Richard had recorded the statement. Vanessa had signed the notice restricting Noah and Claire's access. The enforcement provision applied. The newly discovered equity schedule would be referred for accounting and corporate review. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic collapse, no gasp from a packed gallery. Real justice, Claire realized, often sounded like pages turning and a judge asking whether counsel had anything further. Vanessa's attorney tried to argue that the notice had been administrative, not hostile, but Judge Price looked over her glasses and asked, "Administrative to what end?" The question was so simple it left nowhere elegant to hide. Vanessa lowered her eyes. For the first time since Richard's funeral, Claire felt no need to watch her. The judge confirmed temporary trust authority, suspended Vanessa's discretionary benefits pending final accounting, preserved limited occupancy only under supervised terms, and ordered full review of Claire's deferred equity interest. Then she looked directly at Noah, not at the attorneys, not at the documents, not at the adults who had made a child's belonging into a legal problem. "Young man," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "this court recognizes your protected interest in the Whitmore Family Trust. That does not mean this process will be easy. It means you are not invisible under the law." Noah sat very still. Claire felt his knee touch hers beneath the table, a tiny contact, a lifeline. Outside the courthouse, the December air was sharp enough to sting, and the city moved around them with its usual indifference. Buses sighing at the curb, office workers carrying coffee, a man in a wool coat arguing cheerfully into his phone about parking, as if the world had not just shifted under one boy's feet. Vanessa came out a few minutes later. Her sunglasses were on despite the weak winter sun. She stopped several feet from Claire, far enough to be safe, close enough to be heard. "Richard should have told me," she said. It was not an apology. It was not quite an accusation. It was a truth with nowhere else to stand. Claire nodded once. "He should have told all of us many things." Vanessa looked at Noah, then away. "I did not understand what that house meant to him." Claire almost corrected her. Then she realized Vanessa still did not understand. The house had never been the point. Not really. But some lessons arrived only when a person had finished worshiping the wrong altar. Vanessa walked down the courthouse steps without another word, her attorney trailing behind her with a briefcase full of consequences. Noah watched her go. "Do you think she hates us?" Claire considered lying. Parents were expected to make the world softer than it was, even when the world had clearly misplaced its softness somewhere near the filing cabinet. "I think she is angry," Claire said, "and embarrassed. Sometimes people call that hate because it feels easier than admitting they were wrong." Noah nodded slowly. "Are you angry?" Claire looked across the street at a bare maple tree, its branches black against the winter sky. "I was, for a long time. And now," she turned to him, "now I am tired of carrying things that do not help us grow." That evening, they returned to their small house in West Hartford, the one with the uneven front steps, the narrow kitchen, and the oak table where Noah did homework while Claire paid bills. Nothing about it looked like Whitmore House. It did not need to. Noah placed the blue sailboat on the bookshelf in the living room, between a stack of library books and a framed photograph from his 6th grade science fair. He adjusted it twice, then stepped back. "There," he said. Claire stood in the doorway, watching him make room for a complicated inheritance inside an ordinary home. The trust would take years to settle. The equity review would bring lawyers, accountants, and probably more polite human nonsense dressed in expensive paper. Vanessa would contest what she could. The Whitmore board would protect itself with all the tenderness of a locked vault. But that night, Noah ate grilled cheese at their kitchen table, laughed at a ridiculous commercial, and asked Claire if they could visit Mystic in the spring. She said yes. Later, after he went to bed, Claire sat alone in the living room with the lights low and the little sailboat catching the amber glow from the lamp. Richard's apology had come late. The law had come later. But Noah was upstairs, safe, breathing softly in a room where no one had ever made him feel like a visitor. Claire touched the court order resting on the table, then set it aside. Paper had opened the door. Love would decide what came through it.